It's 7:15 on a typical American morning. You're rushing to get ready for work, scrolling through emails with one hand while reaching for that box of breakfast cereal with the other. The packaging is vibrant, reassuring. Bold claims about heart health, whole grains, and essential vitamins jump out at you. There's a sense of virtuousness as you pour those crispy flakes into your bowl, add the low-fat milk, and congratulate yourself on starting your day with what you've been told is a nutritious choice. Perhaps you even opt for the healthy granola alternative or that convenient breakfast bar, marketed specifically for busy professionals like yourself. What you don't realize in this mundane morning moment is that you've just been manipulated by one of the most sophisticated and carefully orchestrated deceptions in modern food marketing. A deception that impacts not just your morning energy levels, but your long-term health, cognitive function, and even your children's developmental outcomes. This isn't about a single company or product. It's about an entire industry that has methodically re-engineered your understanding of what constitutes breakfast, all while burying the disturbing scientific evidence about what these foods are actually doing to your body. The story begins in 1944, but not for the reasons you might expect. While many associate the rise of processed breakfast cereals with the health food movements of the late 19th century, the transformation of the American breakfast into its current form was largely driven by a wartime crisis. During World War II, the U.S. government was facing critical food shortages and needed shelf-stable, mass-producible foods to feed both troops and civilians. The food industry responded by developing new preservation and processing techniques that would later become the foundation for the modern breakfast style. What started as a practical solution to wartime constraints evolved into something far more troubling in the post-war economic boom. Food manufacturers discovered that these highly processed breakfast foods offered unprecedented profit margins. The raw ingredients, primarily corn, wheat, and rice, cost pennies per pound, while the final products could be sold for dollars after processing, packaging, and marketing. The financial incentive to transform Americans' breakfast habits was simply too compelling to ignore. The industry's first challenge was overcoming generations of breakfast traditions. Prior to the 1950s, most Americans ate breakfasts that varied by region and ethnicity: eggs and bacon, porridges, leftover dinner foods, or simple bread and butter combinations. These diverse, often home-prepared options offered little opportunity for corporate profit or brand loyalty. The solution? A sophisticated three-pronged strategy that would permanently alter the American understanding of what constituted a proper breakfast. The first prong targeted medical professionals. Using selective research funding and strategic relationships with nutrition researchers, the cereal and breakfast food industry began generating studies that appeared to support the health benefits of their processed products. These studies often used problematic methodologies, comparing their sugar-laden cereals not to traditional whole foods, but to the complete absence of breakfast, or focusing on single nutrients like fortified vitamins while ignoring the overall metabolic impact of their products. Dr. Marion Nestle, professor of nutrition at New York University, has documented how industry-funded research is 4 to 8 times more likely to produce results favorable to the sponsor's products than independently funded studies. This creates what nutritional scientists call evidence asymmetry, a distorted body of research that amplifies certain findings while systematically burying others. By the 1960s, these relationships had yielded tremendous influence within major medical associations. The American Heart Association, American Diabetes Association, and eventually even the USDA began incorporating industry-friendly recommendations into their dietary guidelines, recommendations that remarkably aligned with processed breakfast foods, while casting doubt on traditional options like eggs. Internal documents revealed through later litigation show how these relationships were carefully cultivated through research grants, speaking fees, and advisory board positions offered to influential medical leaders. The second prong targeted you directly through what marketing experts call aspirational positioning. Rather than selling breakfast foods merely as tasty or convenient, the industry reframed them as essential components of a productive, health-conscious lifestyle. Advertisements portrayed successful business executives, healthy families, and high-achieving students all starting their day with processed cereals or breakfast bars. The messaging was clear. This is what responsible, health-conscious Americans eat. This positioning was reinforced through carefully constructed visual cues on packaging, images of heart health, weight management, athletic performance, and cognitive function. The industry pioneered what food psychologists now call health halo marketing, surrounding products with so many implied health claims that consumers automatically associate them with wellness, even when the nutritional reality tells a very different story. The third and perhaps most insidious prong targeted children, creating brand loyalty that would span generations. Saturday morning cartoon programming became dominated by cereal advertisements featuring colorful mascots and exciting narratives. These weren't just ads, they were sophisticated psychological operations designed to create emotional connections with brands during children's most impressionable years, Industry documents revealed through congressional investigations showed explicit strategies to position cereals not as food products, but as entertainment experiences that happened to be edible. By the 1980s, the transformation was complete. What Americans understood as breakfast had been fundamentally redefined. The diversity of cultural breakfast traditions had been largely homogenized into a narrow range of industry-produced options. More troublingly, the very concept of what constituted a healthy start to the day had been successfully re-engineered to align perfectly with the most profitable products in the food industry's portfolio. What makes this particularly disturbing is what was happening simultaneously in the scientific community. Research that was actively suppressed or distorted through strategic funding decisions and careful message control. 3 critical scientific realities about breakfast were systematically hidden from public awareness, even as the evidence for them mounted in independent research labs across the world. The first hidden reality concerns the metabolic impact of typical breakfast cereals, granolas, breakfast bars, and even many whole grain breakfast products. Independent research from institutions like the Harvard School of Public Health has consistently shown that these products create what endocrinologists call a hyperinsulinemic response. A dramatic spike in blood sugar followed by an equally dramatic surge of insulin. This physiological roller coaster doesn't just leave you hungry and fatigued by mid-morning. It steadily contributes to insulin resistance, the precursor to metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. The issue isn't merely the added sugars, though many breakfast cereals contain more per serving than dessert foods. The more fundamental problem lies in what food scientists call food structure disruption, the industrial processing that transforms whole grains into the flakes, puffs, and clusters that fill breakfast cereal boxes. This processing so thoroughly disrupts the natural structure of the grains that they're digested and absorbed differently than intact grain foods, creating metabolic effects more similar to pure sugar than to actual whole grains. Dr. David Ludwig, professor of nutrition at Harvard Medical School, has documented how even whole grain breakfast cereals produce blood sugar responses nearly identical to refined varieties. The industry has successfully lobbied for labeling regulations that allow them to claim whole grain status despite this metabolic reality, creating what nutrition policy experts call an information asymmetry, where consumers believe they're making healthier choices while unknowingly consuming what are. Essentially, dessert foods rebranded as breakfast. The second hidden reality concerns protein adequacy and the consequences of protein-deficient breakfasts. While the breakfast cereal industry has masterfully marketed the importance of carbohydrates for energy and highlighted their vitamin fortification, they've systematically downplayed the critical importance of protein at breakfast. This isn't an oversight. It's a strategic choice driven by the fact that protein-rich ingredients are substantially more expensive than the grain-based fillers that maximize profit margins. Research from the University of Missouri's Department of Nutrition and Exercise Physiology has demonstrated that consuming at least 25-30 grams of protein at breakfast significantly improves blood glucose control throughout the entire day, reduces unhealthy snacking, supports muscle maintenance, and enhances cognitive function. Yet, the average breakfast cereal provides just 2 to 4 grams of protein per serving, an amount so inadequate it barely registers metabolically. This protein inadequacy is particularly consequential for children. Developmental neuroscientists at Stanford University have documented how morning protein consumption directly impacts neurotransmitter production, affecting learning capacity, attention span, and emotional regulation. The industry's strategic shift away from protein-rich traditional breakfasts toward highly processed grain-based options correlates directly with documented declines in classroom attention spans and increased behavioral challenges, a connection that industry-funded research has carefully avoided examining. The third, and perhaps most deliberately concealed reality, involves circadian rhythm disruption and metabolic timing. Chronobiologists, scientists who study the body's time-based biological processes, have discovered that the body processes identical foods differently depending on when they're consumed. Your insulin sensitivity, gut permeability, and nutrient absorption patterns all follow distinct circadian patterns, meaning that certain foods may be metabolically appropriate later in the day, but uniquely harmful when consumed as the first meal after an overnight fast. Research from the Salk Institute has demonstrated that concentrated sources of simple carbohydrates, exactly what most breakfast cereals provide, create a particularly damaging metabolic impact when consumed as the day's first meal. This circadian mismatch disrupts metabolic rhythms throughout the day, affects hormone production, and influences gene expression patterns related to inflammation and cellular stress responses. Dr. Sachin Panda, a leading chronobiologist from the Salk Institute, explains it simply. The worst time to consume a high-carbohydrate, low-protein meal is immediately upon waking. Yet this is precisely what the modern breakfast industry has conditioned us to do. The industry's response has been strategic silence. neither acknowledging the science nor funding research that might further explore these inconvenient chronobiological realities. I want to speak directly to you watching this video right now. Have you noticed how breakfast is the only meal where dessert-like foods are not only acceptable, but actively promoted as healthy choices? How we would never consider cookies, sweetened puffed grains, or chocolate-flavored milk appropriate for dinner, yet variations of these exact foods are marketed as nutritious breakfast options? This cognitive disconnect has been deliberately engineered through decades of sophisticated marketing and selective information control. If you're finding value in understanding these hidden realities about your breakfast, consider subscribing to this channel. Unlike typical nutrition content that focuses on superficial calorie counts or trendy superfoods, we dive deep into the scientifically validated realities that food manufacturers work so hard to obscure. The comment section below is open for your experiences. Have you noticed differences in your energy, focus, or hunger levels when changing your breakfast approach? Your observations might help others connect these important dots in their own health journey. What makes this issue particularly urgent is what scientists are now calling the metabolic collateral damage, the documented health consequences of decades of processed breakfast consumption. Epidemiological studies tracking these patterns show disturbing correlations with the rising rates of insulin resistance, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and what neurologists term cognitive vulnerability patterns, subtle but measurable declines in cognitive resilience that manifest later in life. The industry's response to this mounting evidence has been a masterclass in what corporate communication specialists call strategic pivoting, continuously adjusting marketing claims while preserving the fundamental profit model. When concerns about sugar became impossible to ignore, they reduced obvious sugar while increasing maltodextrin and similar ingredients that produce identical metabolic effects but don't register as added sugars on labels. When whole grains became a consumer priority, they developed processing techniques that technically preserve grain components while eliminating the actual metabolic benefits of intact grain structures. Perhaps most disturbingly, the industry has pioneered sophisticated lobbying strategies to ensure that school breakfast programs and federal nutrition guidelines remain aligned with their products. The National School Breakfast Program serves over 14 million children daily, with breakfast cereals and bars as central components, creating what public health researchers call brand normalization from the earliest ages, while establishing lifelong consumption patterns that favor industry products. What alternatives exist beyond this carefully constructed breakfast paradigm? The answer lies not in any single alternative, but in understanding the biological foundations of an optimal morning eating approach, principles that have been systematically obscured by industry influence. The first principle involves what metabolic researchers call metabolic priming, using the first meal of the day to establish optimal hormonal and energy patterns. Research from the University of California's Metabolic Research Unit has demonstrated that a breakfast containing at least 20-30 grams of protein, moderate healthy fats, and minimal refined carbohydrates creates significantly more stable glucose and energy levels throughout the day compared to the typical carbohydrate-dominant breakfast. The difference isn't small. Study participants consuming protein-centered breakfasts showed 60 to 70% greater glucose stability, reported 50% less mid-morning hunger, and performed better on cognitive tests requiring sustained attention and executive function. Perhaps, most surprisingly, these different breakfast approaches actually alter gene expression patterns related to inflammation and cellular repair processes, suggesting that breakfast choices create effects far beyond immediate energy and hunger levels. The second principle involves what nutritional anthropologists call breakfast diversity, moving beyond the homogenized Western breakfast model to incorporate diverse food traditions from around the world. Many traditional breakfast approaches, from Japanese fish and miso combinations to Mediterranean olive oil and vegetable pairings, naturally align with optimal metabolic patterns while offering palatability and cultural significance that highly processed options cannot match. These diverse breakfast traditions share common elements despite their geographic and cultural differences. They typically center real, minimally processed foods, contain significant protein from varied sources, include fermented components that support gut health, and avoid the sugar-laden, ultra-processed characteristics of typical Western breakfast products. The industry has systematically marginalized these traditions, positioning them as inconvenient, time-consuming, or simply not breakfast through decades of consistent messaging. The third principle involves individual metabolic flexibility, recognizing that optimal timing and composition varies based on personal factors, including age, activity level, metabolic health, and chronotype, whether you're naturally a morning person or evening person. This individualized approach directly threatens the industry's one-size-fits-all marketing model, which depends on convincing everyone that highly similar products are universally appropriate. Some people genuinely function best with a substantial morning meal, while others benefit from shortened eating windows that begin later in the day. Some require significant morning protein, while others need moderate amounts spread throughout the day. This biological diversity undermines the industry narrative that everyone must eat breakfast products according to standardized guidelines. Guidelines that, not coincidentally, maximize consumption of their most profitable offerings. The practical implications of these principles aren't about adopting any single alternative approach. Rather, they involve reclaiming your metabolic agency from an industry that has methodically undermined it. This means questioning the breakfast rules you've accepted without examination, experimenting with approaches that better align with your body's signals, and recognizing when marketing messaging is manipulating your perceptions of what constitutes a healthy or necessary breakfast choice. The food industry spends billions annually to maintain its carefully constructed breakfast paradigm, not because these foods offer optimal nutrition, but because they represent one of the most profitable sectors in the entire food market. The technical term for these products in food science is value-added commodities. Basic ingredients transformed through processing into premium-priced consumer goods, with margins that often exceed 500% above ingredient costs.